is Unteaching Sexual Violence and Improv. And we have 3 panelists with us. If they would please join me on the stage. Yay!
Hey, I'm sit in the middle.
That's a great spot. So, let's just dive on in, huh? Do you guys just want to go ahead and introduce yourselves, starting with Mike, and talk a little bit about your background with improv?
Sure. So my name is Mike Fotis. If you don't know me, I am an improviser and writer and comedian in town. I've been improvising for a pretty long time, since around 1998. That's when I was introduced to it. And I'm currently the co-director of the Brave New Workshop Student Union, which, if you don't know, is the Brave New Workshop School of Improvisation.
Hi, I'm Hannah Kuhlmann. I have been improvising here in the Twin Cities since like 2002-ish, but I was an improv nerd when I was a little kid too. I have done short form and long form improv around town, and these days I perform and I direct shows here, and I teach here and stuff. I also have an undergraduate degree in studies in gender and culture and film, and I'm also a sex educator over at the Smitten Kitten. I sling sex toys over there. Love for them and teach over there and do stuff like that. So that's my background.
Hi, I'm James Rone. I've been doing comedic improv for the last 5 or 6 years. Before that, I did non-comedic improv. Since I was in college, I was involved in a style of improvised theater called Theater of the Oppressed, and I did a lot of work with that kind of stuff. I was the teaching company director of Climb Theater for 9 years, which is a touring educational theater group, and the teaching company uses improv in the classroom to begin dialogue about a whole range of issues. I'm also the artistic director of Harbor Theater Group, which is a free collaborative theater program for 15 through 19-year-olds that both performs improv and uses improv as a devising tool. That's me.
Cool. And I'm Joanna Salotaroff. I worked as a community organizer for the last 5 years, and then I've also been trained as an advocate for people who've experienced sexual violence. So that's our panel. Okay.
I'm gonna open a can.
Yeah. Okay, so first let's just talk about comedy and sexual violence in general. Like, for example, are you guys familiar with the incident that happened with Daniel Tosh, where a woman was heckling? He's a comedian, and a woman was heckling him, or he made a joke about sexual violence, and then a woman yelled something out.
She yelled like, "Rape is never funny," or something like
Yeah,
that. Something.
yeah. And then he said, "Wouldn't it be funny if you got raped right now?" And it launched this huge discussion over comedy and sexual violence. And like, is there a place for sexual violence in comedy? Is it something that you should never bring up in the context of comedy? Is it just contextual, or in comedy is it anything goes? And are you essentially like censoring someone when you're saying that you shouldn't joke about that? And Hannah, I know that you have told me about some of the discussions you've read about this, and you have a background in gender studies, so
It's up to me to decide.
Yeah,
right now.
Yeah.
I will now tell all comedians whether it is ever okay to
Yeah.
make a rape joke or not, and I expect them all to stick with my ruling. No, I think that I kind of I'm familiar with the Tosh apocalypse thing that happened. I'm more familiar with like the internet explosion reaction to it. And it set off all these debates. Not so much around here, because I think we have a pretty progressive community where most people tend to like get it and listen to each other and discuss things rather than, lobbing weird, hurtful things across a fence at each other. I think there are many kinds of jokes about sexual assault, but there are jokes about there's improv and comedy about rape culture, and there are jokes that are made at the expense of people who are the victims of sexual assault, or jokes about sexual assault itself being hilarious, or I think there's a really big difference between those.
Can you say what rape? Can you define rape culture? who might not be familiar with
Yeah,
that
sure.
term.
Well, I have an example of jokes about rape culture. There was a Lindy West, who I think is really smart. She's a blogger. She wrote an article on Jezebel about, I think the title was like, how to make a rape joke, and it was like, ugh, but then you read it and you're like, oh, okay, I see what you're saying. She gave a few examples of jokes that had the word rape in them, but were still, they were discussions about, thanks, Mike. You're an ally. There was a stand-up comedian, a young woman stand-up comedian whose name I can't recall, but it's linked in that article on Jezebel. And she had a joke where she was talking about how it was kind of ruefully, horribly funny that at some point most women in America will have that moment where they're like, oh, here's my rape. And and some people were like, not cool, you can never make that joke. And other people, including myself, argued like, I think that that's a great way to discuss the fact that in our culture, that's something that polices most women. The idea that like you can only go out at certain times. You are responsible for protecting yourself from rape. And so that when we talk about rape culture, I think I don't have a super articulate definition of it, but it's a culture in which rape is something that victims are responsible for preventing, or that victims are sometimes blamed for, or a culture of shaming people into, like dressing a certain way, and that it's their fault if they transgress past a certain boundary. Then they're like liable to get into trouble or something like that. So discussing that phenomenon through comedy, I think, is a really important thing. But there's also a difference between stand-up comedy or television or like a podcast, something that an audience would seek out, versus like improv in a theater, like live improv in a theater. The audience has decided, they've agreed to like come along with you wherever you want to go, but I think it's an improviser's responsibility also to like honor the trust that the audience is giving you. So if you are going to, as an improviser, put out content involving sexual assault, like you have to understand your audience pretty well. So maybe pick and choose what environment you're going to discuss what in, and obviously be super conscious of the fact that like for some people they might need to stand up and leave because it's really like upsetting and triggering for them to hear you even discuss sexual assault in the context of like what that stand-up comedian was talking about. Like that might be really upsetting for someone. And that's the risk that you run as a performer. So maybe you don't want to run that risk. Maybe you want to take better care of your audience than that.
Do either of you have anything you want to add?
I think for me, like I don't have much to add to it, although when all that went down, the first thing, and I work with Joe Bozick, so occasionally you'll hear me be like, me and Joe were talking. The first thing that I thought was, when is this going to show up in the classroom? Because I think some people, when they take a class, not everybody, but there's sort of a copycat mentality about things, or when is the conversation going to come up? So that was more where it came from me. I was interested to see, well, how is this going to arise? Where is this going to come from? And honestly, I was surprised that it didn't, because in other classes, when something like that has sort of come up, or it's in the atmosphere, it usually does, but that one didn't so much. So I was surprised for that. But I was interested in my first reaction was, here it comes, and it never really happened. So.
And you brought up the concept of triggering, and I was wondering if you could speak to that a little bit more too, because I think I've heard a lot of people argue like, oh, it's comedy, you shouldn't be offended, but when you talk about a trigger, that goes beyond just offending someone.
Yeah. I don't know. You're looking at me. Do you
Or
want me to answer the question?
Either
if
of you.
anybody else wants
Yeah.
to talk about it. One thing that's been kind of frustrating for me is discussing in the green room or in the lobby or whatever. Some comedians or some improvisers don't have that context of like the difference between something that's offensive and something that might be triggering for someone, because some people just don't know about that certain things, and they're really like weird and hard to predict, can trigger traumatic memories for people who've had to deal with sexual assault in in their life. And so I think sometimes comedians or improvisers or artists or whoever have a very low tolerance for criticism, and then sometimes offensiveness is something that is like that we strive for sometimes, because I don't know, maybe I don't know why it appeals to some people, but I think being offended is something legitimate. I think when something is offensive, it's like it's something that you perceive as like an affront, like someone is intentionally trying to insult you or upset you, and that's something that happens. But triggering things are really different, and I don't know if I think sometimes audience members will react to something because it's triggering a really like destructive, traumatic thing that happened for them, and we as improvisers need to respect that that's a real thing, and not just write it off as like, well, you were offended or you disagree with my opinions, but it's like I said, we have to take care of the audience a little bit. We have to be a little bit compassionate and understand that exists.
One of the things I think is interesting is that the verb that we're using is respect. So like as an improviser, it might be upon us to respect people's reactions. I think one of the reasons why people are so defensive about this is that they assume that they're being prescribed to as artists. So they're sort of like, oh, so now you're telling me I can't ... But that's actually not what anybody is saying.
Right.
At least that's certainly not what I've heard. I've never heard anybody say, nobody can do this anymore. That's the new rule for comedy, all right? That's a new rule for our art form. You can't do this anymore. And instead, I think that what people are urging is introspection.
Yeah.
You know, consider why you chose this particular move. Consider why your move was responded to this way by your scene partner and possibly by the audience. Consider these things, respect these things, make choices based upon what you realize.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but I feel like you can make whatever choice you want, but you can't wash your hands from it and say, I was just playing a character. Like, in some ways I think you can, but you have to be aware of the fact that what you said, what you did, is going to have an effect on the audience, and I don't think you can totally take that step back and say, well, you know, this was just a thing I was doing. I think you have to have some ownership in it.
Yeah.
So that's how I was.
And I think you have to allow the audience to witness what you did instead of just either laughing or being quiet or leaving. You know, like there are more reactions than just laughter or abstaining from reacting. You know.
And James, you have a background. I'm really interested in your background with theater of the oppressed, and also you're the founder of the Harbor Theater Group, and the mission is creating a safe environment for young performers. And I'm just interested, how do you go about doing this? And then also I heard that a little bird told me that you have a background in performance theory and trauma. And if you could speak to that.
Less so with that second piece there,
Yeah.
but I'll start out by just sort of addressing the question. So, first of all, a little bit about Harbor, just for context. It is an ensemble of young people who improvise for performance and to create original work. And it's a group that is intentionally diverse. It's not just diverse in terms of ethnicity comparatively to other improv groups. It is a group that is diverse socioeconomically, and it's a diverse that is intentionally diverse in terms of access to arts experience in the past. So when you work with a group like that, there are a lot of bridges to build. And so that's one of the reasons why we try to build a safe space. But also we're trying to lower inhibitions, because that's how you get to the point where you can truly improvise. So I think this is one of the conundrums that we face when we talk about this, because when you lower inhibitions, whatever comes up comes out. And so sometimes kids who have had traumatic experiences, who've had experience with violence, and kids who have not, things will just pop out, you know? And I even encourage that in audition, you know? I'm like, we're gonna do some free association. If a cuss word comes out, that's okay, you know? And so right from the beginning, we're sort of like, all right, let's just do this. But one of the things that sort of helps me to temper that is the fact that I'm not just lowering inhibitions. I'm not just sort of like, let's forget everything we've been told. I'm also trying to teach an art form. And in my opinion, and this is my personal philosophy on improv, and this is where I differ from other people. In my opinion, if something is offered, great. Whatever it is that's been offered, it's been offered. But you can't act like it wasn't offered. You can't unsee it. So we all know as improvisers, if somebody walks into a scene with a funny look on their face, just because their scene partner offers something that seems to contrast with this, we can't forget that we saw this. It happened, we have to play it. So if somebody brings up something kind of dark in an improv scene, okay, but we've got to play it. We have to see it. And obviously the responses are different depending upon the circumstances of the scene. So if a police officer is taking off her gun and putting it on a table, then we're going to respond differently to that than if your grandmother takes off a gun and puts it on the table in an improv scene. They're two different things, but the gun is there, and we have to respond. So sometimes, and I've noticed this actually in watching Harbor perform, especially when Harbor performs alongside other youth or other improv groups, is that Harbor will go dark sometimes in the middle of a funny set. Like, it'll be funny scene, funny scene, funny scene, really heartfelt, terrifying scene about an abusive relationship, funny scene, funny scene, funny scene. And it's just because, like, when we play, there's nothing that's unplayable. We just have to play it all the way through. And that term playable versus unplayable is something that I've only recently sort of become acquainted with, and it's been through my interaction with a group called Arts in Action, which uses improv as sort of a therapeutic tool, but also just, I'll let them speak for themselves, you should look them up. But they specialize in a kind of improv called DVT, or developmental transformations, where everything is playable. There's nothing that's not playable. And it's terrifying and exhilarating and cathartic. And I can see why some people would love it and some people would hate it, because sometimes you'll find yourself improvising, playing about something horrific. And so to me, one question that sort of puts into my head is about triggers and the way that we respond to them. Some people might respond to seeing their trigger enacted in a way that has them feel repelled, and other people may see that as cathartic. You know, it's, you know, their reaction to it. So when we say we have to respect people's reactions, that also means, I think, not assuming reactions. Not assuming that because somebody's had an experience with something, that they're never going to want to see it acted out. Some people crave it, and they may choose to reenact it themselves as improvisers, you know, so, which is something that happens at Harbor all the time. And then there's just one more story that I'll share, because I think it sort of, it's about this playable versus unplayable thing. So I was at Patrick Henry High School on Thursday, and I was doing a workshop with Project Success. It's a collaboration I've been doing a couple of years now with Laura Garcia there, where we use improv as a way to sort of do the reverse of a decision-making workshop. So you know how decision-making workshops for young people are oftentimes like, consider all of the factors and then think about the consequences and then make the correct decision that you will never regret. So what we wanted to do is something where it's like, well, all right, we all have decisions that we regret. We all do things that we've later decided were mistakes, but then what next? What happens after that point? So we use that decision as the starting point. And so they get to pick what decision they want to work with. This particular class chose whether or not to go to college. And I was working with this one small group that were putting together a character who made the choice not to go to college. They decided this person had an older brother who had gone to college. The entire family's savings had gone towards that. She chose not to pursue it because she didn't want to burden her family any further. I was like, sure, that's a playable character. Because I'm thinking, like, I have 45 minutes. All right, let's go to the next group. And so then I chose that character to hot seat. So we sat the character down and we started asking questions. And they'd been working on their own since I left their group. And I was like, tell me about your character. And she was like, well, you know, I'm 17 and my brother went to college. My family spent all the money on that, and I'm a crackhead and da-da-da-da-da-da. I'm like, what? And when they said I'm a crackhead, everybody else laughed because it was supposed to be a joke. And this is something that happens a lot, especially in communities where drug use and drug abuse is more prevalent. Crackheads are a common punchline. And it rubs me the wrong way. I don't like it. You know, I feel uncomfortable about it because I'm thinking about the person that they're making this joke about.